Moving into Oak Ridge Estates was supposed to be the start of my peaceful retirement. After 30 years with the FBI, I was looking forward to nothing more complicated than tending to my garden and enjoying quiet evenings on the porch. My name is Thomas Reeves, and at 58, I thought I'd left the days of confrontation and evidence gathering behind me. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Neat houses with well-maintained lawns, a community pool, and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed by. What I didn't account for was Vivian Harlow, the president of the Homeowners Association. I first met Vivian 3 days after moving in. She appeared at my doorstep with what she called a welcome packet, but it was really a 3-inch binder filled with rules and regulations. "We take pride in our community standards," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wore a crisp blazer despite the summer heat, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. As she flipped through the pages, pointing out everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the precise height grass should be maintained, I nodded politely. Years in the Bureau had taught me to observe before acting. "And, of course, any exterior modifications must be approved by the board," Vivian emphasized, tapping a manicured finger on page 42. "That includes lighting, landscaping, paint colors, and especially security equipment." I raised an eyebrow. "Security equipment?" "I was planning to install cameras next week." Her smile tightened further. "Well, Mr. Reeves, you'll need to submit a formal request. The board has concerns about privacy and aesthetic consistency. Most requests for visible security cameras are denied, as they detract from our community's welcoming appearance." After she left, I read through the entire binder. Sure enough, buried in the fine print was a clause requiring approval for all surveillance equipment visible from common areas. What the clause didn't specify was the criteria for approval, a deliberate ambiguity that I recognized from years of reviewing legal documents. The next day, I submitted my formal request, complete with diagrams showing the small, discrete cameras I planned to install. As a former FBI agent specializing in surveillance, I knew exactly how to position them for maximum coverage while minimizing visibility. Old habits die hard, and after decades of protecting people, I wasn't about to leave my new home vulnerable. 2 weeks passed before I received a response, a bright red denied stamp across my application with Vivian's signature beneath it. No explanation provided. I called the HOA office and was told by the secretary that the board determined the equipment would violate community aesthetic standards and that further applications for similar equipment would not be considered. That evening, I noticed my neighbor, Eleanor Matthews, an elderly woman who lived alone, crying softly on her porch. I walked over to check on her. "Everything all right, Mrs. Matthews?" I asked. She wiped her eyes quickly. "Oh, it's nothing, dear. Just these silly HOA fines. They say my rose bushes are 3 inches taller than regulation. $300 on my fixed income." Her voice trembled. "But Vivian says if I don't pay by Friday, it'll double." I looked at the perfectly maintained roses. "Have other neighbors received similar fines?" Eleanor nodded. "The Patels across the street got fined because their children's bicycles were visible in their driveway for more than an hour. And poor Mr. Johnson, he's been in the hospital, but they're fining him daily because no one's mowing his lawn." Something inside me, the part that had spent 3 decades pursuing justice, woke up. This wasn't just about my cameras anymore. This was about abuse of power. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I pulled out my old field notebook and began formulating a plan. If Vivian wanted to play by the rules, we would play by the rules. All of them, including ones she might not be aware of. I hadn't spent my career building cases against organized crime and corrupt officials without learning a thing or two about documentation, evidence, and the precise application of pressure. The next morning, I installed my security cameras anyway, but hidden completely from view, carefully positioned to monitor my property while complying with the letter, if not the spirit, of the HOA regulations. Then I made a few phone calls to old colleagues and began my investigation into Vivian Harlow and the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. If there was one thing my FBI career had taught me, it was that people drunk on small amounts of power often leave trails of misconduct behind them. Little did Vivian know that her newest resident had spent decades gathering evidence against people far more dangerous and sophisticated than a power-hungry HOA president. The game was on, and I was playing for keeps, not just for my right to secure my home, but for Eleanor Matthews, the Patels, Mr. Johnson, and every other neighbor being bullied into submission. My first step was thorough reconnaissance. I spent the next week walking through the neighborhood at different times of day, noting violations that went unfined at certain homes while similar issues at other properties received immediate citations. The pattern was disturbing, but not surprising. Homes belonging to Vivian's friends on Maple Lane had overgrown hedges and non-regulation mailboxes without consequences, while families on Elm Street received violation notices for the smallest infractions. One evening, I spotted Vivian herself prowling through the neighborhood with a measuring tape and camera, documenting violations with an almost gleeful expression. She stopped at the Martinez family's home, where their 10-year-old daughter had drawn cheerful sidewalk chalk designs on their own driveway. Vivian took multiple photos, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The next day, Maria Martinez knocked on my door, her eyes red from crying. "Mr. Reeves, you seem to understand these things. Can they really fine us $200 for sidewalk chalk? Sophia was just drawing butterflies for her grandmother who's visiting." I invited Maria in for coffee. As she showed me the violation notice, my blood boiled. The citation referenced an obscure bylaw about defacement of communal visual spaces. The fine was due in 5 days, with a 10% increase for each day it was late. "Maria, may I keep this?" "I promise I'll help," I said, carefully placing the notice in a folder where I'd begun documenting every HOA interaction. That night I made a crucial decision. I drove to my storage unit across town and retrieved equipment I hadn't touched since retirement: a digital voice recorder, a high-resolution camera with zoom lens, and my old case notebooks. I might be retired, but these tools had served me well tracking cartel activity and building federal cases. They would serve me again now. Over the next 2 weeks, I created a systematic approach to gathering evidence. During my morning jogs, I photographed all the violations that went unfined at board members' homes. I attended an HOA meeting with my voice recorder hidden in my jacket pocket, capturing Vivian's dismissive tone as she denied reasonable requests from homeowners while fast-tracking her friends' applications for additions and modifications far more intrusive than my security cameras. The meeting was particularly revealing. Vivian presided like a queen on her throne, flanked by her 2 closest allies on the board: Bradley Whitmore, a retired corporate lawyer who handled all HOA legal threats, and Diane Keller, who, as treasurer, controlled the financial accounts. When questioned about rising HOA dues, Diane shuffled papers and provided vague answers about administrative costs. When pressed further by a brave homeowner named Sam Donovan, Vivian abruptly moved to the next agenda item. After the meeting, Sam approached me in the parking lot. "You're the new guy, right? The one who keeps asking questions." He glanced around nervously. "Listen, I used to be on the finance committee before Vivian kicked me off. There are some strange transfers happening with our reserve funds. Nothing I could prove, but enough to raise concerns," I finished for him. "Would you be willing to tell me more somewhere private?" Sam nodded. "My wife's out of town this weekend. Stop by Saturday morning. I've kept copies of some things. Saturday couldn't come fast enough." Sam's documents revealed questionable contracts with landscaping and maintenance companies owned by Vivian's brother-in-law, all charging well above market rates. There were also expense reports for community improvements that no one had seen materialize. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Sam whispered, spreading the papers across his dining table. "The HOA collected $40,000 for a playground renovation last year. They installed a swing set and claimed the rest went to permits and safety features. There's no way that basic equipment costs that much. I photographed every document. Sam, this is excellent work, but I need to build an airtight case. Do you know anyone else who might have information? Sam thought for a moment. Talk to Gabriela Diaz. She was HOA secretary before Vivian brought in her own person. Gabriela took minutes at all the meetings, including the closed executive sessions. As I left Sam's house, I noticed a car slowly driving past. A silver Mercedes I recognized as Diane Keller's. Our eyes met briefly before she accelerated away. I memorized her license plate out of habit, though I already knew where she lived, in the largest house in the community, despite her job as a part-time school administrator. Something didn't add up. That evening, as I reviewed my growing evidence file, a loud knock startled me. I opened the door to find Bradley Whitmore, the HOA's lawyer, standing there with a stern expression. "Mr. Reeves," he said coldly, "the board has received reports that you've installed unauthorized surveillance equipment on your property. This is a direct violation of your previous denial notice. I'm here to inform you that effective immediately, you're being fined $100 per day until the equipment is removed." I maintained a neutral expression. "That's interesting, Mr. Whitmore, because I haven't installed any visible cameras. Perhaps you'd like to point out which bylaw prohibits security equipment that isn't visible from common areas?" Bradley's face reddened. "Don't play games, Reeves. We know what you're doing. The rules are the rules." "Yes," I replied calmly. "The rules are indeed the rules. All of them, including state laws regarding HOA governance and financial disclosure requirements." I watched his expression carefully. "I'd be happy to remove any equipment that violates the actual written bylaws. Feel free to show me where my invisible cameras are mentioned." Bradley stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. Vivian runs this community. People who make trouble don't last long here. She has ways of making homeowners wish they'd never moved in. Your little cameras are just the beginning. Back off now, or you'll regret it." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Mr. Whitmore, I found that threats work best when the person making them has clean hands. Please give my regards to Vivian." I closed the door, heart pounding not from fear, but from certainty. The response to my quiet information gathering had been swift and disproportionate. They were worried, and people who are worried make mistakes. That night I received emails from 3 neighbors reporting sudden, extreme fines for violations they swore didn't exist. The Martinez family had been cited again, this time for excessive noise during daylight hours when their daughter was practicing piano. Eleanor Matthews received notice that her beloved rose bushes would be forcibly removed if not cut back by morning. The Patels were threatened with liens against their property for unspecified, persistent violations. The pattern was clear. Anyone seen speaking with me was being targeted. Vivian was sending a message. What she didn't realize was that each retaliatory action only strengthened my case. The next morning, I drove to visit Gabriela Diaz. She lived in an apartment 20 minutes from Oak Ridge Estates, having sold her home shortly after being removed as HOA secretary. When she opened the door, I saw a woman worn down by stress, her eyes wary as she evaluated me. "Mr. Reeves, Sam said you might come. I don't know what he told you, but I don't want any trouble." She began to close the door. "Mrs. Diaz, neither do I said quickly. "I just want to understand what's happening in our community. People are being harassed, and I think you know why." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "You're fighting a losing battle. Vivian Harlow destroyed my life when I questioned her methods. My husband and I had lived in Oak Ridge for 15 years. After I was removed from the board, the fines started. Endless violations, each more ridiculous than the last. We couldn't keep up. Eventually, we had no choice but to sell, at a loss, because who wants to buy a home with HOA liens against it?" As we sat in her modest living room, Gabriela revealed the full extent of Vivian's operation. The HOA had become her personal fiefdom, where she rewarded loyalty and punished dissent. Board elections were manipulated by scheduling them during working hours when most homeowners couldn't attend. Financial reports were deliberately obscured. And, most troubling, the growing HOA Reserve Fund, now over $500,000, was managed with minimal oversight. "The worst part," Gabriella said, her voice breaking, "I have copies of everything. Meeting minutes where they openly discussed targeting problem homeowners, emails planning how to force elderly residents to sell so investors could buy at reduced prices, evidence of kickbacks from vendors. I kept it all because I thought someday someone would care enough to do something." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a thumb drive. "It's all here. But be careful, Mr. Reeves. These people ruined my life. They won't hesitate to ruin yours." I took the drive, feeling its weight far beyond its physical presence. "Mrs. Diaz, may I ask why you haven't taken this to the authorities?" She laughed bitterly. "Bradley Whitmore plays golf with the district attorney. The local police chief lives in Oak Ridge, with no HOA violations, despite his boat parked in his driveway year-round. Who exactly should I have trusted?" As I drove home, the thumb drive secured in my pocket, I recognized the familiar contours of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just petty tyranny, it was organized corruption. The tactics were the same ones I'd seen in my FBI cases: intimidation, selective enforcement, financial obfuscation, and strategic alliances with authorities who should provide oversight. I pulled into my driveway to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. As I ripped it down, my neighbor across the street, Peter Wilson, called out to me. "They got you too, huh?" Peter walked over, shaking his head. "Everyone's getting them today, even people who've lived here for years without issues." I scanned the notice. Unapproved landscaping modifications. $500 fine. The only change I'd made to my yard was adding a small garden of native plants that actually complied with the xeriscaping guidelines in the HOA's own rulebook. "Peter, how long have you lived here?" I asked. "Going on 8 years now. It wasn't always like this. The problem started when Vivian became president 3 years ago. Before that, the HOA was reasonable. They handled the pool maintenance, organized block parties. Now, it's just fines and threats." "And nobody's challenged her?" Peter lowered his voice. "A few tried. The Johnsons filed a complaint with the State Housing Authority. 2 weeks later, their house was broken into, nothing valuable taken, but all their HOA documents were missing, and their computer was wiped. Coincidence? Maybe, but they sold and moved out the following month. That night, I locked my doors, backed up Gabriella's files to multiple secure locations, and made a decision. It was time to leverage my FBE background beyond just gathering evidence. I called Marcus Rodriguez, a former colleague who now worked in the white-collar crimes division of the state police. "Tom Reeves," he answered warmly. "Retirement boring you already?" "Marcus, I need advice on handling a situation, unofficially." I outlined what I'd discovered, careful not to mention specific names yet. Marcus listened intently. "Sounds like you've got enough for us to at least open a preliminary inquiry. HOAs fall into a gray area jurisdictionally, but the financial mismanagement and possible kickback scheme moves this beyond civil matters. Forward what you have, and I'll have someone take a look. I appreciate that, but I need to handle the initial confrontation myself. These people have been bullying my neighbors for years. I want them to face the community they've been terrorizing before they face the authorities." Marcus chuckled. "Still need to be the one leading the charge, eh? Some things never change. Just be careful, Tom. Corrupt people with something to lose can be dangerous, even in suburban settings." I spent the next 3 days organizing the evidence, creating multiple presentation copies, and developing my strategy. I'd need allies beyond Sam and the scattered homeowners who'd shared their stories. I needed to break Vivian's climate of fear. My opportunity came sooner than expected. The next day's mail brought a notice of an emergency HOA meeting to discuss security concerns, and community standards enforcement. The timing wasn't coincidental. Vivian was planning to make an example of me. Perfect. She was bringing the battleground to me, just as I'd hoped. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time when most homeowners would be at work, unable to attend. I spent the morning making phone calls, asking neighbors to take extended lunch breaks or call in sick if necessary. This meeting will determine the future of our community, I told them. We need everyone there. By 1:30 p.m., I arrived at the community center with a briefcase containing organized folders of evidence, a laptop with Gabriella's files, and a small digital recorder. The room was already half full. Far more residents than typically attended these meetings. Vivian stood at the front with Bradley and Diane, whispering urgently as they noticed the unusual turnout. Their concerned expressions deepened when Eleanor Matthews arrived, helped by her daughter who had taken time off work to bring her. The Martinez family came next, followed by the Patels and at least 15 other households I'd spoken with. Vivian's eyes narrowed as she watched me greet each family. I could almost see her recalculating her approach. At precisely 2 p.m., she called the meeting to order, her voice artificially pleasant. Thank you all for coming to this special session of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. We have several urgent matters to discuss, primarily concerning recent security concerns and compliance issues. She shuffled her papers, avoiding eye contact with the audience. First, let me remind everyone that recording devices are not permitted in— Point of order, I interrupted, standing up. According to state law governing homeowners associations, specifically Statute 53-8-44, homeowners have the right to record any open meeting of the association. Private executive sessions may be restricted, but this is a general meeting announced to all residents. A murmur spread through the room. Vivian's face flushed. Mr. Reeves, while we appreciate your enthusiasm for participation, the HOA bylaws clearly state, "State law supersedes HOA bylaws." I continued calmly. I have copies of the relevant statutes here if you'd like to review them. I pulled a document from my briefcase and approached the front table. Additionally, I've brought copies for any homeowner who would like to understand their legal rights regarding HOA governance. Bradley Whitmore leaned over to whisper something to Vivian, who pressed her lips together tightly before nodding. Fine. Let's move on to the first agenda item. There have been increasing reports of covenant violations throughout the community. The board has decided to implement a more stringent enforcement policy effective immediately. Fines will be increasing by 50%, and after 2 violations, homeowners will lose access to community amenities. A concerned murmur swept through the audience. I remained standing. Ms. Harlow, before we continue, I'd like to request clarification on the violation assessment process. Many homeowners, myself included, have received citations for alleged violations that don't appear to match the written bylaws or are selectively enforced. Vivian's smile tightened. Mr. Reeves, this meeting isn't a forum for individual grievances. If you have specific concerns about your violations, you can schedule a private appointment with the board. I nodded thoughtfully. This isn't about my individual case. It's about a pattern affecting our entire community. I turned to face my neighbors. How many people here have received violation notices in the past month? Nearly every hand went up. And how many feel these violations were fairly assessed according to the written guidelines we all agreed to when purchasing our homes? All hands went down. This isn't coincidental, I continued. I've documented over 70 cases of selective enforcement in just 3 weeks of observation. I pulled out a folder and began distributing photocopied pages showing side-by-side comparisons. Board members' homes with unnoted violations next to ordinary residents cited for identical or lesser issues. This is outrageous, Vivian snapped. You've been photographing board members' private property. I've been documenting public-facing aspects of properties visible from community streets, the same standard used by the HOA when issuing violations. Nothing I've done violates privacy laws or HOA regulations. Bradley Whitmore stood up. This meeting is getting off track. Mr. Reeves, if you have complaints, there's a proper process. I'm familiar with proper process, Mr. Whitmore, I replied. 20 years with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit taught me quite a bit about proper process. A hush fell over the room. I hadn't planned to reveal my background so early, but the moment felt right. Vivian's face drained of color. The FBI? She stammered. Retired now, I clarified, but old habits die hard. When I see patterns of selective enforcement, financial discrepancies, and intimidation tactics, I tend to get curious. Eleanor Matthews spoke up, her voice quavering but determined. They fined me $300 for rose bushes while Diane's hedges are 2 feet taller than regulation. I've lived here for 15 years and never had problems until I spoke against the pool renovation budget last year. Others began sharing similar stories. Fines that appeared after they questioned board decisions, approval requests denied without explanation, while board members' friends received immediate approvals for larger projects. Vivian banged her gavel repeatedly. This is not the purpose of today's meeting. We have a formal agenda. Let's talk about that agenda, I interjected. Particularly the security concerns you mentioned. I assume you're referring to my security cameras, which were denied despite meeting all aesthetic guidelines outlined in Section 4.3 of the Community Standards. Your application was reviewed and denied, Bradley stated firmly. End of discussion. Actually, I countered, according to HOA bylaws, any denial must include specific reference to which standards weren't met. My denial had no such explanation, but that's a minor issue compared to what else I've discovered. I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector that the board used for their presentations. With Mrs. Diaz's permission, I'd like to share some HOA meeting minutes that were never distributed to the community. The screen displayed an executive session transcript where Vivian explicitly directed selective enforcement. Focus violations on the troublemakers first. Once they're dealt with, the rest will fall in line. Another slide showed emails between Vivian and her brother-in-law's landscaping company, discussing inflated invoices with the excess being channeled back through a consulting company owned by Diane Keller. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Diane jumped to her feet. This is slanderous. You hacked private emails. No hacking required, Mrs. Keller. These were all provided by former board members who kept records, concerned about exactly this type of misconduct. I changed to another slide showing the playground renovation budget, $40,000 allocated, but invoices totaling only $12,000, with the remainder transferred to an administrative consulting fee. Now, let's discuss the reserve fund, I continued. According to the annual financial statement, the HOA has accumulated over $500,000 in reserves, far beyond what's required for a community our size. Yet, according to the bank statements I've obtained through proper legal channels, the actual account holds less than half that amount. Bradley slammed his folder shut. This meeting is over. Mr. Reeves, you'll be hearing from our attorneys for defamation and unauthorized. Before you continue that threat, Mr. Whitmore, I interrupted, you should know that I've already provided copies of all this documentation to the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Real Estate, and my former colleagues at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. This wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be by the end of the day. The room erupted. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions at the board. Through the chaos, I noticed Sam Donovan slip quietly to the back of the room, phone in hand. He caught my eye and nodded. He was recording everything. Vivian, face contorted with rage, shouted over the noise. This is all a misunderstanding. These documents are taken out of context. We've done nothing but try to maintain community standards. Then you won't mind a forensic audit, I replied calmly. In fact, since we're all here, I move that we vote for an immediate independent audit of all HOA finances and a freeze on any fund transfers until it's complete. You can't call for a vote. This isn't a regular meeting, Vivian protested. Actually, I countered, pulling out the HOA bylaws, Section 7, paragraph 3 states that any homeowner may propose a motion during any meeting where a quorum is present. We have well over the required 20% of homeowners here today. Maria Martinez stood up. I second the motion for an audit. All in favor? I called out. A forest of hands rose throughout the room. Motion carries, I announced. Now I believe we should also vote on temporarily suspending all violation fines until a complete review of enforcement practices can be conducted. This is absurd, Bradley sputtered. You can't just— Second, called Eleanor Matthews, rising shakily to her feet. Another vote, another overwhelming majority. Vivian, Bradley, and Diane huddled together, whispering frantically. Finally, Bradley approached the microphone. The board will need to consult with legal counsel regarding the validity of these impromptu votes. In the meantime, this meeting is adjourned. He gestured to Vivian and Diane, and the three of them quickly gathered their materials and headed for the door. One moment, I called after them. You might want to take this with you. I held up a thick manila envelope. It's a formal request for all financial records from the past 5 years, signed by over 50 homeowners. According to state law, you have 15 days to comply or face potential personal liability. Bradley snatched the envelope and stalked out, followed by Vivian and Diane. As the door closed behind them, the room burst into applause. For the next hour, we held an impromptu community meeting. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other began sharing stories, forming committees, and planning next steps. I provided guidance where I could, explaining the legal processes ahead and helping organize the documentation many had brought with them. As the meeting wound down, Peter Wilson approached me. Tom, I've lived here for 8 years and never knew half these people's names. Now we're planning a community picnic together. How did you do this? I smiled. I just reminded everyone what they already knew, that they have rights and that they're stronger together than isolated. As I walked home that evening, my phone rang. Marcus Rodriguez from the state police. Tom, we looked into those files you sent. It's worse than you thought. That playground equipment, the company doesn't exist. It's a shell corporation. And we found similar patterns across 3 other HOAs in the county, all with connections to your board members. My pulse quickened. So this goes beyond Oak Ridge. Much beyond. We're pulling bank records now. I think you've stumbled onto something significant here. The state attorney general is interested. I thanked Marcus and hung up, my mind racing. This explained the excessive reserve fund and the aggressive tactics. Our community wasn't an isolated case, but part of a larger scheme. When I reached my driveway, I found Vivian Harlow leaning against her car, waiting for me. Gone was the imperious HOA president. She looked smaller somehow, her carefully maintained facade cracking. You've ruined everything, she said flatly. Years of work, destroyed in one afternoon. You ruined it yourself, Vivian, I replied. Communities aren't meant to be fiefdoms. You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When I started, I just wanted to keep the neighborhood nice. Then Bradley showed me how much money we could make with the right adjustments. It was so easy. She looked away. No one ever questioned anything before you came. People questioned, I corrected her. You just silenced them. She reached into her purse and I tensed instinctively. 2 decades of fieldwork had trained me to be cautious, but she merely pulled out a USB drive. This has everything. Account numbers, transfer records, Bradley's entire system. She held it out. I want immunity. I'll testify against him and Diane. I didn't take the drive. That's not my decision to make anymore, Vivian. Turn yourself in, cooperate fully, and let the prosecutors decide. She laughed bitterly. You really were FBI, weren't you? Always by the book. Not always, I admitted. But in this case, the book protects you too. Voluntary cooperation looks much better than getting caught fleeing. As if on cue, a police car turned onto our street, moving slowly. They're here for the financial records, I explained. Not for arrests, not yet, but soon. Vivian's shoulders slumped. I never thought I'd go down over an HOA. Few people realize that the same laws governing major financial institutions apply to community associations handling large sums of money, I said. The playground fund alone would qualify as felony misappropriation. She nodded slowly, then straightened her jacket with a remnant of her former composure. I'll cooperate, but I want it noted that I came forward voluntarily. I'll make sure that's clear, I promised as the police car pulled up to the curb. 2 officers approached, and I recognized one as a former colleague from a joint task force years ago. We nodded to each other silently, and I stepped back as they began explaining the warrant to Vivian. As they escorted her to provide the financial records from the HOA office, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Matthews. Community meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. Everyone's coming. We need you to help us build a better HOA. I smiled as I typed my reply. I'll be there. That night, I sat on my porch, ironically the first time I'd properly relaxed there since moving in, and reflected on how differently my retirement had turned out than I'd planned. I'd wanted peace and quiet, but instead found purpose. In the days that followed, the case expanded rapidly. The State Attorney General's office uncovered a network of financial fraud spanning 6 HOAs across the county. Bradley Whitmore was arrested attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. Diane Keller turned state's evidence, revealing an elaborate scheme that had siphoned nearly $2 million from community funds over 3 years. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing homeowners about years of intimidation tactics. Gabriela Diaz spoke publicly for the first time, her voice growing stronger as she detailed the systematic abuse of power. They didn't just take our money, she told the reporter. They took our sense of community, our feeling of safety in our own homes. The Oak Ridge Estates story sparked investigations into HOAs statewide. My phone rang constantly with calls from homeowners in other communities, attorneys general from neighboring states, and even a producer from a national news program wanting to feature our community's story. At our community meeting, we elected an interim board with a unanimous vote for new bylaws requiring financial transparency, recorded meetings, and strict limits on fines and enforcement powers. Eleanor Matthews was elected treasurer, her accounting background finally put to good use. The Patels took over community events planning, and Maria Martinez headed a new neighborhood support committee focused on helping elderly and vulnerable residents. When my turn came to be nominated for board president, I surprised everyone by declining. I'm better behind the scenes, I explained. Besides, I think Sam Donovan has shown exactly the kind of leadership we need. Sam, who had been meticulously documenting the financial discrepancies long before I arrived, was elected by acclamation. After the meeting, Eleanor approached me, her eyes bright with renewed energy. You know, Thomas, when you first moved in, I thought you were just another quiet retiree like me. I never imagined you'd lead a community revolution. I smiled. I didn't lead anything. I just showed everyone that they already had the power to stand up for themselves. Nonsense, she replied, patting my arm. You were exactly what we needed, someone who wasn't afraid. Do you know what Vivian told me once when I questioned a fine? She said, "You should be grateful we let you stay here at your age," as if my home of 15 years was something they were generously allowing me to keep. The indignation in Eleanor's voice reminded me of why I'd spent my career fighting injustice in all its forms. Some bullies carried guns and operated in shadows. Others wielded HOA bylaws and operated in community centers. The methods differed, but the impact on victims was surprisingly similar: fear, isolation, and a sense of powerlessness. A month after the emergency meeting, the first arrests were made. The local news captured footage of Bradley Whitmore in handcuffs, being led from his law office. Diane Keller negotiated a plea deal in exchange for her testimony. Vivian, true to her word, had cooperated fully and received probation rather than jail time. The most unexpected development came from Mr. Johnson, the elderly homeowner who had been hospitalized when I first arrived. Upon recovering and learning what had transpired, he revealed that he had been keeping meticulous records of HOA violations and responses for years, including audio recordings of conversations with board members. His documentation provided the final pieces needed to bring criminal charges against the worst offenders. "I may be old," he told me as we reviewed his evidence files together, "but I was a court reporter for 40 years. I know how to document misconduct." As summer turned to fall, our community began to heal. The renovated playground was finally completed, with proper equipment at a reasonable price. The community pool, which had been restricted to members in good standing, essentially excluding anyone who had opposed the board, was reopened to all residents. Property values, which had stagnated under the oppressive regime, began to rise as word spread about our reformed management. One crisp October evening, as I was finally planting the garden I'd been planning since moving in, Maria Martinez's daughter Sophia rode by on her bicycle, stopping to watch me work. "My mom says you used to catch bad guys," she said, her eyes wide with curiosity. I chuckled. "Something like that." "And now you caught the bad guys here too," she continued, "with your secret cameras." I set down my trowel and turned to her. "The cameras helped, but do you know what really stopped them?" She shook her head. "People coming together, being brave enough to speak up. That's always more powerful than any surveillance equipment." She considered this solemnly. "Like when everyone came to the meeting." "Exactly like that. One person can gather evidence, but it takes a community to create change." Sophia nodded thoughtfully, then brightened. "We're having a block party on Saturday. Mom says you have to come because you never leave your house except to investigate things." I laughed. "Tell your mom I'll be there." As Sophia pedaled away, I returned to my gardening, reflecting on how differently this retirement had turned out than I'd expected. I'd spent decades in the Bureau believing I was protecting communities from external threats, only to discover in retirement that sometimes the greatest threats came from within, from the small accumulations of power left unchecked. My security cameras, the original point of contention, had been installed and approved through proper channels. They were barely noticeable, discreetly positioned to monitor my property without infringing on anyone else's privacy. In the end, they had been far less important than the relationships built, the courage fostered, and the community restored. The following week brought another unexpected development. I received a letter from the National Association of Housing Administrators inviting me to speak at their annual conference about ethical HOA management and preventing abuse of power. Apparently, the Oak Ridge Estates case had become something of a cautionary tale in HOA circles nationwide. I showed the invitation to Sam during our weekly coffee meeting where we discussed community affairs. "Are you going to do it?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "I'm considering it," I replied. "There's a pattern here that extends beyond our neighborhood. The same vulnerabilities exist in HOAs everywhere: minimal oversight, concentrated power, and homeowners who don't know their rights." Sam nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when you first started asking questions, I thought you were just another angry homeowner who'd eventually give up. Most do." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "The system counts on people giving up." Later that day, I called Marcus Rodriguez to update him on the latest developments in our case. "So much for your peaceful retirement, huh?" he chuckled. "Back to fighting corruption, just on a smaller scale." "I'm not sure the scale is smaller," I replied. "The dollar amounts might be, but the impact on people's lives is just as significant. When it's your home at stake, no case feels small." Marcus grew serious. "You know, our department has been discussing creating a specialized unit for housing-related fraud. The Oak Ridge case opened a lot of eyes. Would you consider consulting? Nothing full-time, just lending your expertise." I hadn't expected this turn of events, but it made sense. My investigative skills hadn't disappeared with retirement, and this new arena, where financial crimes intersected with community governance, needed the same attention as any other criminal enterprise. "Let me think about it," I told him. but tentatively, yes. By December, snow dusted the rooftops of Oak Ridge Estates, and holiday decorations appeared on doors and windows without fear of arbitrary fines for excessive ornamentation. The community newsletter, once a vehicle for announcing new restrictions, now highlighted neighborhood achievements and volunteer opportunities. Eleanor Matthews's rose bushes, carefully protected through the winter, would bloom again in spring without threat of removal. The Martinez family installed a small basketball hoop for their children without lengthy approval processes. Mr. Johnson, fully recovered, held weekly chess games in the community center that had once been Vivian's domain. On Christmas Eve, I attended the community holiday gathering, watching neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now embracing like old friends. Peter Wilson approached, handing me a mug of hot chocolate. "Hard to believe this is the same place," he said, gesturing around the festively decorated room. "Do you miss the excitement? The investigation?" I considered his question. "I miss the purpose sometimes. But I've found there's always more work to be done, more people who need help navigating systems designed to overwhelm them." "Well, we're grateful you chose our little battleground for your retirement project," Peter said, raising his mug in a toast. "To security cameras, the HOA violation that saved a community." I laughed and clinked my mug against his. "To neighbors who refused to be intimidated." As the evening wound down, I walked home through the quiet streets, noting the holiday lights reflecting off the fresh snow. My hidden cameras, now properly approved and installed, recorded my approach, a silent reminder of where this all began. Inside, I settled into my favorite chair and opened my laptop to begin drafting my speech for the Housing Administrators Conference. On my screen was a new email from Gabriela Diaz, containing a link to a housing advocacy group she had founded to help other HOA victims. "Your retirement hobby is becoming a movement," she had written. "How does it feel to be a community hero in your golden years?" I smiled as I typed my response. Less peaceful than planned, but far more fulfilling. Outside my window, snow continued to fall on Oak Ridge Estates, no longer a battleground of petty tyranny, but a community reclaiming its name one neighbor at a time. My security cameras watched over a peaceful street, their purpose transformed from personal protection to a symbol of justified vigilance. The screen showed nothing unusual, just homes where people now lived without fear of arbitrary punishment, where children could draw with sidewalk chalk, where elderly residents could grow roses that stretched a few inches too tall. It was, I reflected, exactly the kind of ordinary peace worth fighting for. 3 years later, I stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional hearing on predatory housing practices. What had begun with my simple request for security cameras had evolved into a national movement for HOA reform. The Oak Ridge model, as it was now called, had been implemented in over 500 communities across the country. "Mr. Reeves," the committee chairwoman said, "your background in the FBI gave you unique tools to expose this corruption. What can average homeowners do when faced with similar situations?" I leaned into the microphone. My FBI training helped, but it wasn't what ultimately changed things. What transformed Oak Ridge Estates was people finding the courage to stand together. One person collecting evidence is important, but a community refusing to be silenced is unstoppable. As I testified about how seemingly mundane HOA abuses could escalate into sophisticated financial crimes, I thought about how far we'd come. The Oak Ridge case had resulted in federal guidelines for HOA governance, including mandatory financial disclosures, term limits for board members, and protection for whistleblowers. Bradley Whitmore was serving 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Diane Keller, after cooperating extensively, received 3 years of probation and was working to make restitution. Vivian Harlow, whose cooperation had been instrumental in unraveling the larger scheme, had moved away from Oak Ridge and was, ironically, now working with a housing rights nonprofit. My testimony that day led to the creation of the Federal Housing Governance Oversight Committee, tasked with investigating similar cases nationwide. Marcus Rodriguez had been appointed as its initial director, bringing his expertise in financial crimes to this new arena. Back in Oak Ridge, our community had become a case study in revival. Property values had increased 23% in 3 years, not because of restrictive aesthetic rules, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a neighborhood known for its strong community bonds and fair governance. Eleanor Matthews Garden had won the county's Beautification Award 2 years running. Her roses, once the subject of arbitrary fines, now attracted garden enthusiasts from across the state. At 84, she had become something of a local celebrity, featured in gardening magazines and mentoring younger residents in sustainable landscaping practices. The Martinez family had established a community arts program, transforming the walls of our community center with vibrant murals painted by neighborhood children, the same creative expression that had once been punished with violations and fines. The Patels had expanded their community engagement beyond Oak Ridge, helping 3 neighboring HOAs restructure their governance based on our transparency model. Mr. Johnson, despite his advancing age, had become a fierce advocate for homeowners' rights, testifying alongside me at state-level hearings. Sam Donovan continued to serve as our board president, implementing innovative programs that other communities now sought to emulate. Under his leadership, Oak Ridge Estates had created a community assistance fund to help residents facing temporary financial hardships, ensuring that no one would lose their home over an inability to pay legitimate association dues. Peter Wilson had established a mentorship program pairing retired residents with neighborhood teenagers, creating cross-generational bonds that strengthened our community fabric. The program had reduced juvenile incidents in our area by over 60%, according to local police reports. Gabriela Diaz's housing advocacy organization now had offices in 12 states, providing legal assistance to homeowners battling corrupt boards. She often cited the Oak Ridge case as proof that systemic change was possible, no matter how entrenched the corruption seemed. My own role had evolved far beyond what I could have imagined that first day when Vivian Harlow appeared on my doorstep with her binder of rules. What began as a simple desire to install security cameras had become a second career focused on housing justice. I split my time between consulting with law enforcement on HOA fraud cases and mentoring community organizers in effective advocacy techniques. The hidden cameras that started it all remained on my home, though they were now part of a neighborhood-wide security network that had reduced property crime by 35%. More importantly, they served as a visible reminder that observation works both ways. Those in power must also be willing to withstand scrutiny. On the 5th anniversary of the emergency HOA meeting that had changed everything, we held a community celebration in the park that had once been the site of the overpriced playground. The new playground, properly funded and magnificently built, was filled with laughing children. Families gathered around picnic tables, sharing food and stories. Elderly residents sat in comfortable shade, watching with satisfaction as a community once divided by fear now united in fellowship. As twilight descended, Sam called for everyone's attention and asked me to join him at the small podium set up for the occasion. 5 years ago, he announced to the gathered neighbors, Thomas Reeves moved into Oak Ridge Estates hoping for a quiet retirement. Instead, he found a community in crisis and used his lifetime of skills to help us reclaim our neighborhood. Sam turned to me with genuine emotion. We wanted to show our appreciation for all you've done. From behind the podium, Eleanor and Maria unveiled a small bronze plaque mounted on a stone pillar at the park entrance. It read, Oak Ridge Estates Community Park, where justice found a home. Dedicated to Thomas Reeves, who taught us that true security comes from neighbors standing together. I was speechless as applause erupted around me. When the crowd quieted, I stepped to the microphone, emotion tightening my throat. When I installed those first hidden cameras, I began, I was thinking only of protecting my property. I never imagined they would help protect an entire community. But that's the thing about security. Real security isn't about cameras or fences. It's about people watching out for each other. I gazed across the faces of people who had become far more than neighbors. The greatest threat to justice isn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of rights through seemingly small abuses of power. What happened here wasn't just about money being stolen. It was about dignity being taken, voices being silenced, and homes becoming places of anxiety rather than sanctuary. The setting sun cast long shadows across the park as I continued. In my FBI career, I pursued criminals across borders and jurisdictions. But here, in what was supposed to be my quiet retirement, I found that the most important jurisdiction is the one we share with our neighbors, the community we build together. As stars began appearing in the evening sky, I concluded with the truth that had emerged from our struggle. Security cameras can record what happens, but only people can change what happens. Thank you for being those people. Later that night, I sat on my porch as I had done that first evening after moving in. The neighborhood was quiet now, houses glowing softly with interior lights. My security monitors showed peaceful streets where children's bicycles could be left outside without fear of violation notices, where garden ornaments reflected personal expression rather than conformity, where American flags and pride flags and sports team banners all flew without regulatory interference. My phone chimed with a text from Marcus. Testimony resonated with the committee. National legislation likely to move forward. You've started something big, old friend. I smiled, watching the monitors that had once been my private rebellion against petty tyranny. They now served their original purpose, simple home security, in a neighborhood where security meant something far deeper than cameras and alarms. On one screen, I noticed Eleanor Matthews step onto her porch across the street, waving in my direction before settling into her own chair for her evening ritual of watching the stars emerge. I waved back, a quiet acknowledgement between neighbors who had fought a battle together and built something precious in the aftermath. In that moment, I realized the most powerful security system was the one we'd created together. Not technology, but community. Not surveillance, but mutual support. Not rules enforced through fear, but values upheld through respect. The cameras that had once been forbidden now watched over a community transformed. And I, who had spent a career observing the worst of human behavior, now had the privilege of witnessing the best. Ordinary people creating extraordinary change. One home, one street, one neighborhood at a time. That, I decided as I turned my gaze from the monitors to the real homes they protected, was the true meaning of security, and the most valuable outcome of a retirement that had proven to be anything but quiet.